Hello and welcome to today's video on the Crucible. Today we are going to be looking at Act 1, Part 1. This section will be the beginning of Act 1 through to where Proctor enters. But before we dive into the Act, there are a few things that I want to go through with you just so that you have these ideas and these key aspects of the play that you can look out for when you read the play. So the idea is that we will look now at a few aspects of the play. Then you will read the section or listen to the audio, and then you'll come back to the second part of this presentation where we'll go through that part of part one of Act 1 in more detail. Okay, so there are a few dramatic devices that I would like to draw your attention to so that you can be looking for these and how they're being used in the first part of Act 1 and also beyond that section as well. So these are what I want to talk about: structure, language, irony, characters, and themes. So firstly, let's have a look at structure. This is a really key aspect, I think, especially for Act 1. So as you know, Act 1 is the exposition. It gives us information about what's happened before the action of the play begins, so as to enable the audience to understand what is happening now. So at the same time, it has to set the action of the play into motion to engage our interest in it and to sustain our curiosity as to the eventual outcome of the play. And one way that the writer, Arthur Miller, does this is that he starts Act 1 in medias res. Okay, I don't know if you remember this technique in medias res, where basically it's Latin for in the middle of things. So Act 1 starts in the middle of things, and so we're trying to play catch up. So we're having to find out what has happened before we've started viewing this scene, and then we're seeing what's happening now, and then we want to know what's going to happen next. Okay, so it's a really clever way of getting our attention. So we're learning about what's happened before, we are seeing what's happening now, and then we want to know what happens next. And because Arthur Miller structures it in this way, the action is really quite vigorous. So no time is wasted in the old convention of having two characters hold a conversation that is usually intended only to convey information to a passive listening audience. Paris's anxiety over Betty or himself, and his cross-examination of Abigail ensure that the action is underway from the moment the curtain rises, while at the same time our attention is directed to the unexplained events of the previous evening. The background of quarrels among the townspeople gradually revealed in the dialogue between Proctor and Paris, and in that between Corey and Putnam. So we're really intrigued by all these little bits of information that we're getting as to what really is happening in this town. And then we get my favorite part, Proctor's earlier relationship with Abigail, and that emerges equally naturally in their conversation with each other. So notice how we're getting a lot of information through the dialogue. Now, however, drama often depends for its effectiveness more on the withholding of information than on the imparting of it. And our curiosity as to the events of the previous night is stimulated by being kept unsatisfied. So do you notice, I don't know if you did or not, throughout Act 1, we are given little bits of information. We're drip fed little bits all the way through. We're not given all the information at the beginning, and we're not given large chunks at the beginning. We are getting slowly drip fed that information all the way through, and you think that you've understood it a little bit. You've got a bit of information. Oh yeah, they're dancing. Titterbug was doing something a bit weird and freaky. Oh, someone's naked. Okay, interesting. And then you think that, okay, that's it. But then later on in the scene where the girls start having their little secret conversation, you start to get more information about that someone starts drinking blood. So when you feel like you've got more information, then you get even more, and you realize that actually things are not what they seem and not what they appear to be, which is really important for a play like this, where you're dealing with a community where its religion and its faith is fundamental to how they live and behave. So it plays with our understanding of what we expect of people, and this sort of behavior is not what we would expect. All right, so I may have deviated a little bit on structure, but I think it's really, really fascinating. So, interestingly, Millen's his first version of the play, began with a scene in the woods, which was dropped in production because it added to the cost and wasn't really essential to the action. So, interestingly, he originally had that scene of the girls dancing, but they got rid of it. So, because they removed that scene, the ambiguity surrounding this incident was really strengthened. And so he actually uses that ambiguity for that effect. So Miller builds up by allowing the characters to make conflicting statements about what took place, and by not indicating which account we ought to believe. So it's also a useful way of reminding us that it was only on this flimsy, unreliable, and very questionable evidence that the whole witch hunt was based. So, through the structure, we see that it's primarily used to create tension. So be aware of that. Be aware of where the tension rises. At what point does the tension increase in the act? Usually, the tension increases when people enter or exit the scene. So I usually do, when I make my annotations as I'm reading through a play, I always make note of exits and entrances of characters. Who's come in? How has that increased or decreased the tension? So we have, in this Act 1, we are already seeing that there's an atmosphere of tension, there's a mood of uncertainty, and there's an impression of a really disturbed township. These people are disturbed. So there are as many as 13 characters that are introduced, and their comings and goings create a sense of excited activity. Their anxiety over the strange happenings, their superstitious credulity, and their suspicions of each other prepare us for the events that are to follow. Betty's irrational behaviour and Titterbug's breakdown under the questioning create a dramatic tension that culminates vividly into the final hysterical chanting. What a great way to end this act. The abruptness of this ending, very effective in the theatre, serves another purpose too. Everything happens too quickly for us to be quite clear why Abigail has joined in the denunciations, and the stage directions deliberately offer no comment beyond, suggesting by the use of words like inspired and enraptured that she may have genuinely experienced a religious conversion. We are, in short, hardly more certain than the characters themselves whether the girls are deceiving us or whether some supernatural force really is at work. And the unexpectedness of the outburst intensifies this. The only moment of quiet in the whole act comes with the entrance of Hale. Yet we are not entirely assured that he is as stable and as sound a personality as he seems. Our interest in this act is sustained by uncertainty. and by the desire for some resolution of our doubts in the ensuing acts. Okay, so that was a bit of a long, little bit of a discussion of structure, but I think it's worth bringing those ideas to the fore of your mind. Okay, so that's structure. Let's look at, just quickly, I'm not going to go into, you'll be relieved, not going to go into that much detail with language, but a few little points I'd like to make about language. So, as you've seen, language is quite simple. Because really, the characters in this play, they're simple country people. But Miller creates some occasional peculiarities of expression. Okay, and he does this because he's wanting to create an archaic, sorry, that's not very well written, let me try and fix it up, an archaic flavor, okay, to the language. And he does that because he wants to distance the play from the 20th century when it was written. Okay, a lot of writers do that. They want to separate and distance their play from the contemporary world, and so they need to create that sense of time. And Arthur Miller does that quite cleverly with his language, and it's not overly played, and it's fitting being in this religious community. But he has little expressions like, for example, it be instead of it was, and let you take hold here, and pray you do this, or I like not, okay, things like that. Or even just the way that married women are addressed as Goody, so Goody Proctor, Goody Putnam. This is a 17th century usage of the good wife. They used to call married women, instead of Mrs., they would call her good wife Proctor, or good wife, and they've abbreviated it to Goody. So that's why people use that term. The only character who's really a little different in their language is Tituba. She speaks English less accurately than the other characters, which is fitting for her being a black West Indian slave. So couple other things I want to say about the language. You see the word providence popping up. So it is a providence that this is happening, and they're saying things like this is a very fortunate thing, but there's an added implication that it's divinely ordained. So I want you to be aware of that. A lot of the time where they will see things happening, they see that it is because that is the will of God, and that's what God wants. And as soon as you start using language that has those connotations, you then are elevating the situation to a spiritual level. And then you think, well, you don't want to, get in the way of what God wants, do you? And so now it gives it a higher authority. We have this this society is referred to. So when you see the phrase this society, not merely the people of Salem in general, but specifically they're talking about the covenanted members of the church, so the special group who are in authority in the church. Okay, so that's mainly what I wanted to say about language. I'm going to go on now to talk to you about irony. So when we talk about irony, we are talking about the three main types: verbal, situational, and dramatic. I think that predominantly Arthur Miller is using situational dramatic irony in his play. And can I just say that his use of irony is just so clever. So irony abounds throughout the Crucible. As characters who believe they are combating the devil's handiwork actually perform it themselves. The ruthlessness with which the suspected witches are treated is aimed at purifying Salem, but it achieves the opposite outcome. The town slips further and further into chaos and paranoia until it reaches a point of total devastation. As Reverend Hale says to Danforth, "Excellency, there are orphans wandering from house to house, abandoned cattle bellow on the high roads, the stink of rotting crops hangs everywhere, and no man knows when the harlot's cry will end his life. And you wonder yet if rebellion spoke?" So we can see here the situational irony, the fact that they were trying to cleanse their town, and in effect they've actually done the exact opposite. The court's attempts to preserve Puritan morality by arresting and executing accused witches ironically lead to the removal of the most virtuous people from society. And we think particularly of poor Rebecca. These people are the only ones who refuse to throw out false accusations or lie about involvement in witchcraft, so they find themselves condemned. This means that much of the population that remains is comprised of the power-hungry, the selfish, and the cowardly. And that's really the message that we're left with at the end of the play. Well, one of the very, I should say. Okay, let's look at characters. So there are lots of characters that we see in the first act, but I want to primarily for you to focus on in the first part, so just the part one of what we're going to look at today, looking at Paris. And I want you to pick up on any actions that he does that reveal something about his character, were things that he says or people say about him that helps us to get a sense of who he is. And also Abigail, my favorite character. What do we learn about her in this part? Also thinking about Thomas Putnam, this deeply embittered man he's referred to in the notes. He's a character. What can I say? He's the prime mover and shaker. And as we learn, so many accusations against people are in the handwriting of Thomas Putnam. Now, we also look at not just Abigail, but her little group of gaggle of girls. We're introduced to Mary and Mercy, and some of the others, but it's interesting because I feel like Mary and Mercy are very much opposites. Mary is weak, she's easily led. We get a sense that she really does want to do the right thing, but she struggles against the powerful forces of her peers, as well as the simple human characteristic of just not wanting to get into trouble, not wanting to have to face the consequences of your actions. Mercy is she's very similar to Abigail. They are very common sense girls who know exactly what they want and how they are going to get it, and they seem to lack the moral integrity, and they understand their position in society, and it's not as firm as others. They are more vulnerable, and so they need to find ways to succeed in this world without that position of power and authority that they would have if they had more money, if they had parents that were in higher status. So as we look at this part, take note of these characters. Okay, let's have a little think about themes and what themes we can be looking out for. So remember, when we are looking at themes, we're looking at what the writer is attempting to convey to the viewer. The Crucible's themes have lent the play artistic longevity because more or less they're really universal to the human experience across time. If you hope to write an awesome essay on the Crucible, you should have extensive knowledge of its themes. if you can show that you understand the themes of a work of literature, you've really mastered the material on a deeper level. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to touch on the themes of hysteria, um, reputation, and power. There are other themes that we can be looking at, like guilt, misogyny and women, for example, or deception. There are a few others that we can be looking at, but for now, I'm just going to focus on these three. So, a few things I want to say about hysteria. The thematic significance of hysteria builds very quickly as accusations of witchcraft proliferate throughout Salem. The power of collective hysteria ultimately becomes insurmountable because it grows larger than the influence of the few rational voices in the community. And I see this really touches on another little sub-theme of the collective versus the individual. So you can also make note of that. The seeds are planted in Act 1 when Abigail is questioned about her activities in the woods and ends up accusing Tituba of witchcraft to avoid punishment. The town already, I don't know if you noticed this, but they are very primed with rumors of black magic. It's almost like they've been waiting for their opportunity to jump at this. They are quickly willing to accept that the first few women who are accused are involved in black magic because they're beggars and slaves. No one considers that the accusers are lying, partially because they're seen as innocent children, and partially because many witches confess to avoid, well, when I say witches, many witches in inverted commas there, confess to avoid the death penalty. Understandably. So armed with the false proof of these coerced confessions, the court officials aggressively persecute anyone who is accused. So we see that hysteria blinds the people of Salem to reason as they become convinced that there is a grand satanic plot brewing in town, and they must not hesitate to condemn anyone who could be involved. This is a lesson in how fear can twist perceptions of reality, even for those who consider themselves reasonable and under normal circumstances. So you can also be looking out for examples of fear and how fear is motivating a lot of the characters. Okay, so reputation. Concern for reputation is a theme that looms large over most of the events in the Crucible, and it's really quite obvious in this first part of Act 1. Though actions are often motivated by fear and desires for power and revenge, they are also propped up by underlying worries about how a loss of reputation will negatively affect characters' lives. John's concern for his reputation is strong throughout the play. His hesitation to reveal Abigail's true nature is a product of his own fears of being labelled an adulterer. Once there have been enough convictions, the reputations of the judges also become factors. They are extremely biased towards believing they have made the correct sentencing decisions in court thus far. So you can see that they are very reluctant to accept any new evidence that will prove them wrong, because that means they would have to admit that they've done the wrong thing or they've been in the wrong, and therefore their reputation is going to be questioned and muddied. So the importance placed on reputation helps perpetuate hysteria because it leads to inaction, inflexibility, and in many cases, active sabotage of the reputations of others for selfish purposes. So the overall message is that when a person's actions are driven by desires to preserve favourable public opinion rather than to do the morally right thing, there can be extremely dire consequences. And here we have another sub-theme that you can look out for, which is appearances versus reality. What are people hiding? What are people covering up? What are they masking? And why? Okay, last one, power and authority. The desire to preserve and gain power pervades the Crucible, as the witch trials lead to dramatic changes in which characters hold the greatest control over the course of events. Abigail's power skyrockets as the hysteria grows more severe. Where before she was really just an orphan teenager, now in the midst of the trials, she becomes the main witness to the inner workings of a satanic plot. She has the power to utterly destroy people's lives with a single accusation, because she is seen as a victim and a savior. The main pillars of traditional power are represented by the law and the church. And when we have the law and the church together, that is what we have as a theocracy. And I think also Arthur Miller may be making a little comment here about the dangers of that as well. These two institutions fuse together in the Crucible to actively encourage accusers and discourage rational explanations of events. It keeps those people who are in power, and those people who are weak and vulnerable keeps them in their place. So the girls are essentially given permission by authority figures to continue their act because they are made to feel special and important for their participation. The people in charge are so eager to hold on to their power that if anyone disagrees with them in a way the trials are conducted, it is taken as a personal affront and challenged to their authority. We think about Danforth, Hathorne and Paris. They become even more rigid in their views when they feel they are under attack. Okay, so when you read and listen to part 1 of Act 1, I want you to think about these questions. What sort of community does Salem seem to be, and how well do the inhabitants get on with one another? Has anything encouraged me to be more sympathetic to some characters than to others, and if so, to which and why? How sure can I be that I know exactly what took place in the wood, and in what ways, if any, has the play made me curious to know more about it? And which moments of this act were particularly exciting to watch and why? These questions are just here to guide your thinking and to help you with your annotations. So now you can read or listen to Act 1, Part 1, just from the beginning of Act 1 through to where just before Proctor enters, and then come back and we will do a bit of a recap of that section. Thank you.